Welcome to the Genesis Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Sean. Along with me is Pastor Ryan. Join us this year as we study the book of Genesis and go through our brand new series, Foundations, where we'll see God's design for everything, where it's gone wrong, and how his plan of redemption has been seen from the beginning. Now, let's join the conversation. Hey, welcome to the Genesis Podcast. This is episode 4. Ryan, excited for this conversation today. We're going to be talking about Christ and culture, the divine counsel, and we might even get into male and female dignity and these genders that God designed for us from the beginning. So to kick things off, we just came off of a sermon. You were discussing primarily the sermon being titled Man, or
Let Us Make Man.
Let Us Make Man. Thanks for helping me out there. Appreciate that.
You got it.
And this is a subject that right now in our culture moment can be hot, can be a big subject.
For sure.
So where I want to go first is you alluded to it in your message, but discussing these different viewpoints on Christ and culture and how we as Christians can view culture. And I just think these frameworks might be helpful for us.
Yeah, I think in the message we covered this idea of the creation mandate or the cultural mandate. That's where this comes from. So Genesis 1:26, let us make man in our image. We'll come back to the us and our and talk about it a little bit more. Yep. People definitely had questions about that after the message. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. God created Adam. He created them, male and female. And so that's kind of the creative background and act. But then the blessing and the commissioning comes, which is the creation mandate or the cultural mandate. Different biblical and church tradition tribes talk about that differently because they have different views of how Christians are to engage culture. So when we say the cultural mandate, that can give an implication of like Christians are to shape the culture. In an extreme sense, you have certain segments of what would be dubbed like Christian nationalism. And that's a hot button subject as well. Many people who are very politically interested are like, what's wrong with that? Like being Christian and being a nationalist is better than being a non-Christian and a globalist, or a secularist and a globalist. But to not confuse that concept means something a little bit different. And it's more of a view that's like, we are God's governing body on earth, the church. Therefore, we sit over culture and like craft it and make it what we want, what it should be. And though we certainly want to influence culture, this leads to a debate in Christian circles on how Christians and the kingdom of God, of which we are a part, and then its physical representation, the church on earth, how we are to engage with culture. So there's kind of like 5 classic views on this. I think this is how you say this guy's name. Richard Niebuhr has a famous book, a well-known book, Christ and Culture. And there's like 5 essentially views. And I'm looking at that right now just to help me remember it. There's Christ against culture, which is kind of the first possible view. That is essentially people would espouse being loyal to Christ and the church requires or necessitates a rejection of culture and society. So it's this significant emphasis then on obviously withdrawal and building a separate culture that is against and always will be against the culture at large. Then the opposite end is the second view, which is like Christ of culture. So it locates Christ, not in antithetical opposition of culture. It locates Christ within the culture. So this would be, like Gnosticism in the past, or just a large portion of Protestant liberalism today. Essentially, this idea is Jesus is the fulfiller of society's hopes and aspirations. He's the great enlightener. He's the great teacher. He's the one who, directs us towards moral wisdom and perfection and peace in our age. So it synthesizes. And, this is where you get essentially the culture can kind of swallow and readapt Christ, in my opinion. So you have Christ of culture, Christ against culture. The third view would be Christ above culture. And according to Niebuhr, he would say this has been more the position of church history. So seeing the issue between God and humanity, God above, humanity below, not just God in the generic world. So within that, there's a few like subtleties. There's a few different options. There's Christ and culture in paradox position. So it's a part of the above culture, but they're just going to be paradoxical, like set that way forever. And I think I probably lean a little more that way specifically. But the other one is Christ as the transformer of culture. So it's like, yeah, Christ is above culture. God is working things out that he wants with humanity, but our job as humanity within culture is to transform culture to the glory of Christ. I think that's true as well. I just don't think that we're going to transform culture to the Edenic ideal.
Sure.
What I mean by that, I'm trying to help people with my language, to the status of the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
I don't think that the church, and this would be those who take eschatology views of like post-millennialism, which I'm not a post-millennialist, but I realize I just opened a can of worms. Generally speaking, you have three kinds of thoughts in the Bible as it relates to the end things concerning the millennial age or the millennial reign. You're either a post-millennial, which means the church is going to essentially transform culture to such a degree that it'll become near perfect and Christ will then return. So the church ushers in Christ's return. Then you have premillennialism. It's the idea that the culture actually doesn't get much better. The church is kind of a seasoning, salting voice, but it's adjacent to majority culture. And then Christ comes and then judges and renovates the earth, and then we experience the millennial reign. Or you have the amillennial view, which from this conversation of Christ and culture more connects to premillennialism, but it's kind of the idea of like, yeah, no, it's just that the millennium is now, and there's this tension of the church age, but also the darkness and wickedness of evil still kind of happening at the same time, and it's not all going to be resolved till Christ comes. So this does dip a little bit into your end times way of thinking, but essentially you have three options in Christ above culture. So let me zoom out. You have 5 total options. Number 1, Christ against culture.
Yep.
Number 2, Christ in or of culture. Then you have Christ above culture. And in the 3 views, you have a synthesis view, which is like it's both Christ and the culture. You have Christ in paradox to culture. Then you have Christ transforming culture. That's essentially the 5 views. And this is kind of a lot. I would just reference people that are interested and want to dig deeper.
Yeah.
There's some great articles on this. Niebuhr has a book on this. You can find good blogs on this. This is kind of like relatively well known if you're willing to do a little bit of research, Christian perspectives on culture. You can even just Google Christ and culture, and you'll find some good resources to read to expound on this.
Yeah.
But the reason it matters is because the creation or cultural mandate, we find its location in Genesis 1. And so in Genesis 1, we get to be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth, have dominion. So what does that sound like to you? That's not absent of culture. When Adam and Eve would multiply, when they would have babies, and their babies would have babies, would have babies, would have babies, would have babies, what do you get when you make a bunch of people? What do you get when you have a town, a city? When you get a lot of people living together, you get culture. And what culture is a kind of a social contract of what our values, our beliefs, and our behaviors are. That's what culture is. And it's contentious because not everyone agrees or thinks the same way about it. And so when you get the instruction from God to Adam and Eve to make babies, subdue the earth, pull the latent potential out of the earth. So like with farming and tool making,
Which
and
you're very familiar with.
I'm very familiar with that. Yeah, and language and art and expression, like that's all subduing the creation.
Yeah.
So like all that stuff is, where does it come from? It comes from God making humanity in his image with lowercase c creative capacity. And so we can create film and art and music and sculpture and architecture and rules and literature and sports and hobbies and recreation and civilization. So then it just naturally comes to, well, what happens then when the fall happens in Genesis 3? God is still given that creational culture making mandate to humanity.
Yeah.
Every one of us, even if you're not a Christian, you have that in you because of the image of God.
Yep.
That's why we have such beautiful, rich history of culture and expression. So how do we think about that? Like,
Yeah.
do we run from that? Do we live in that? Do we baptize that and put a little Jesus sticker on it?
Yep.
Do we synthesize it? Do we try to like be a paradoxical witness to it? Do we transform it? How do we engage with that?
Yeah.
And I just want people to realize that there's been lots of views on that. And again, for me, I would not be Christ against culture, though I do think that there's some merit there. I think we have to be very careful to not be swallowed up by culture. I take my language here from Jerry Sitzer, Dr. Jerry Sitzer, friend, mentor, local guy, great, author, church historian. And he would just say, you got to find a way to influence the culture without running from it or accommodating to it.
Yep.
You have to figure out how to not just get swallowed up in the culture to where Christianity loses all of its distinction. Christ is just one of the many religious or philosophical ways of being. But you also have to figure out how to not just, in effort to preserve your distinction, run away from culture. And that's the temptation we feel. I mean, we went through just such a tough season in COVID. You think about government overreach and you think about, fear of neighbor getting sick and loved ones getting sick and this tension of like, how do I navigate this? It's this issue. Do we run away from culture? Do we go, man, I don't like the laws in my state. I don't like the decisions our mayor made or our governor made. So I'm out. Like I'm moving to a new state.
Yeah.
People did that. And I think if the Lord directed them to do that, not everyone did that for that reason, but for some it was like, well, that's a little bit of the Christ against culture view. People might not have known that, but that's kind of what it is. It's like more of a separatist view. Like we're going to homeschool our kids. We're not going to put them in culture. We're going to kind of create our own little enclave of counterculture. That'd be more of a Christ against culture view. Christ of culture would be like, no, we're going to send our kids to all the public things, and we're just going to believe that the things that the public wants, as it relates to goodness and peace and joy and satisfaction in life, that behind all those things is really God. That'd be like the liberal view of just kind of like, well, they want peace and harmony and good, and God's the author of peace and harmony and good, and so we're called to love each other and love our neighbor. So whatever makes you feel like we're loving you, that's good. Well, that's full selling out to culture, and I don't think that's a good view as well. So to me, it has to be in the third category, which is Christ above culture, and I just think the transcendence of God, the sovereignty of God, the resurrection and ascension of Christ to the right hand of the Father, just in my opinion, seems to be the more biblical historical view, that it's not Christ against culture or absorbed by culture, it's Christ above culture. But then how? Is it kind of a synthesis, like we're following in areas where we can follow culture and we can say that's the common good, we say okay, but areas where we sense and see the, Christ leadership, we say we synthesize them? Or is it a paradox? We're going to operate in a way that is essentially kind of a how would you describe that? Kind of like a mystical, like it's like kind of confusing for the average person, but behind that is really Christ's truth. Or are we going to get really engaged and transform culture? Again, I'd be somewhere personally in like the last two. I think there's an element of Christian thinking, believing, and behaving that's just paradoxical, and that's how we season the world. And I think we're also called to transform culture, but I don't, because of my eschatological view, think the church can fully transform culture.
Yep.
I think the culture is always going to be set against God and in bondage to the spirit of the age until Christ returns.
Yeah.
So that'd be my view.
Yeah. When at the end of your sermon, you were giving this image of this athlete in the beauty of their body ability to move, or maybe a musician, right? And there's just this idea that like the mandate for culture that God set in place is a beautiful thing. We even get to interact with it. And it left me with this feeling like, man, this is hopeful. But then I left church and I would get in my car and I was driving home and I just had this sense of like, man, but like, is the world actually getting better? And I don't know, like help me with that. How to engage culture now, because our country, we're in a post-Christian context. The majority view is not our own, and so there's a sense of, it's not full-on persecution yet. Like, we don't know what that's like, but it's to the point where it's not everybody's for us any longer. Yeah. So I don't know, how do we engage culture in a way that's healthy? Because it sure feels like the mandate that God set in front of us it's a hopeful one.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to delineate which parts of culture need redeeming, need celebrating, and need resisting. So I just think it's like it requires wisdom.
Yeah.
So I think there's things in culture we should celebrate, like the impulse to, honor life. We should celebrate, diversity. We should celebrate the dignity of everyone. We should celebrate hard work. We should celebrate all sorts of things.
Yeah.
There's things that we have to redeem. We have to kind of say, that's been twisted. So like, we should redeem our culture's vision of sexuality.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't say the church is against sexuality. It's envisioning sexuality under the lordship of Jesus in alignment with the scriptures, which is uncomfortable because most people in our culture are going to interpret our desire to redeem an element of culture as us being hostile to culture. And that just comes down to so much of our tone, I think. I think it's tone. Anyway, I think there's other parts of culture we just have to flat out resist. We just have to go, that's just like anti-Christ. That's just not it. So I think elements of culture, I don't know. I'm trying to give you an example. So like the glamorization of violence and evil and sexual exploitation that you often see in a lot of our films and a lot of our like movie or music and stuff like that. I think it's kind of like we can redeem the method of music, but there's certain kinds of this stuff I just would have to go, that's just not edifying. That's not going to work.
Yeah.
So I don't know. The truth is it's hard. This is why this is such a hard subject. And I even find myself grappling with it in this conversation because I feel like I'm kind of like constantly doing all three of those things.
Yeah.
Celebrating, like even with one issue, I'm like trying to celebrate someone's desire that's good and located in a biblical story, but I'm also trying to help them see that the way it's being expressed needs to be resisted, and then the new version they can emerge with is redeemed.
Yeah.
Like I just feel like we're doing it constantly. So yeah, I have found we did a staff chapel like it was a few years ago, and we went through the whole thing, 5 options, had a big old discussion on it, and like how we kind of feel and think about it, how we were raised. And then, just had a good discussion. So I think it's just good discussion. And I brought it up in the sermon because, again, culture making is God's gift to humanity. Because if we're going to multiply, subdue, and rule, we're going to create culture.
Yeah.
We're going to create civilization and culture. And so the question is, does God care about that? Oh, he sure does. It needs to be, we want it to be in a way that it will honor and glorify God, right? Like, we want our culture and our own country and our families and our church and our city to honor God.
Yeah.
But then you just get into the kind of the philosophical question of like, will it ever?
Yeah.
Because not everybody believes like you believe.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we live in a pluralistic society. And as you use the term, even an increasingly post-Christian society, the founding of our country was definitely more in alignment with the idea of a God, even if he's kind of absent. And many of the founding fathers were Christians. There were some who were not, some who were deists. They kind of like, the truth is all of them really embraced the utility of a theocentric worldview. And I think it was Adams who said like, America is designed for educated and moral people. The Constitution isn't going to work if we're not educated and moral. And the reason for that is because we have a governmental structure in our founding documents that's largely based on natural law and self-governance. Like, I think it was de Tocqueville, a French philosopher, comes over and evaluates the American project in the 1800s and is so impressed that we can have the Constitution we do, and the kind of republic that we do with so much freedom, because the truth is there was so much regulation of behavior and action occurring at a spiritual, moral level.
Yep.
People were like, you don't have to have as many laws and things about stealing and everything else when like there's a moral law that says it is good for me to respect your property.
Yeah.
So as the country has drifted from some of our moorings, in a spiritual sense and in a moral and educational sense, like it makes it even harder, because you're kind of like, you're seeing more of the culture war. I mean, that's how many, whether it's elections or we all talk about the culture wars. That's over gender and sexuality and over abortion, and over, small government, big government, taxes, immigration. You have culture warring over this because different belief structures that different people hold is creating a different kind of society that's grappling with these laws.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to that. I'm not a poli-science guy. Like, I'm not like a political science expert. I like theology. I like the Bible.
Yeah.
Obviously I live in this world, so I care about it. But yeah, I don't want to overspeak my credentials. You know? Like I've had some great conversations with people in the church that are more passionate about this and have helped me with it. I just think it's good stuff. It's good stuff to discuss. And again, my point, and I'll let you have the ball back. We'll keep bouncing it. It's just, I just want to remind everybody, we have culture because we have a creator.
Yep.
And the creator delegated creative abilities to humanity.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful thing. And that's still happening. And we want to do that as Christians in a way that honors God and brings glory to his name.
Yeah. Yeah. We're humans. We want answers to be black and white. And what I kind of hear you saying here, and how do Christians engage culture, is it takes wisdom.
Yep.
And, in our house, we've been watching this brilliant show called The Chosen, which I recommend, which I highly recommend to anybody listening.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I've read the New Testament a few times, and Jesus has this amazing, amazing knack for talking to the Pharisees, who were smart people, but they would ask him a question because they thought they just had him pinned. They're like, this guy's going to answer the question, we're going to get him. And he's able to respond to them in a gracious and kind way that just navigates their, quote, smartness with his wisdom.
Totally.
And it punctures their own heart. And I just think there, what I hear you saying about culture is like, whether you see culture getting worse or getting better or more hopeful or optimistic, like that is why we apprentice Jesus, is because he is the true master of navigating culture.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. And again, it does matter, because if you're more of the Christ against culture, you're probably more interested in like having a bunker and like having some beans and some, tinfoil blankets and some ammunition. You're probably thinking more like, that. And if you're more Christ of culture, you're thinking, well, where we're going is not so bad. A bunch of fuddy-duddy fundamentalists are in the way. Like, we just got to get up to with the times. And if you're taking somewhere in the middle, that Christ above culture, then you're in, which I think is the right position. You're kind of in a nuanced wisdom posture. Like, what of this is redeemable? What of this must we resist? Because there is element of both of those things that are true. Like the first two, there is an element of like elements of culture that is not good.
Yeah.
It's because of sin, and we have to resist that. But then there's elements where it's like, actually, we can have common ground there. It's one of the things I think that I see right now that's very interesting, is I see it's an era of strange bedfellows. That's what I feel like is happening right now, as the philosophical landscape is redrawn, as culture is changing so rapidly. As I've mentioned, there's so much redefinition of everything. And what's happening is you're finding strange bedfellows. You're finding people who necessarily have not in the past run together in the same framework of thought, but they're saying, let's team up and let's become allies. Because the truth is, even though we might not agree on these areas of finer theology, we would rather have a world and a country that lives like there's a God. So that's why you see some characters, some deists, and some, those who would be Orthodox Jews, and those who'd be Christians, and those who'd be some of those individuals coming together and go, look, we've debated and not agreed on some major stuff, but from a civics perspective, from a government and policy and cultural perspective, we'd rather have our society shaped by the ideal there's a God, then there's not one. And it is always interesting to me. I say all this without kind of really having like a large convinced position in the fight. I just notice it, right? And I just think we're in that time. That's why I think we're in a time of a lot of significant change. Culture is changing faster and faster and faster. We have seen so much change on the subject and issue of gender and sexuality in the last 10 years. We've seen more change in 10 years than we have in hundreds of years. I just had an article linked to me from one of my relatives who was discussing, as it relates to economy, the advent of artificial intelligence as assistive technology in a bunch of different elements of our society. And his advocation was, I think in the next 5 years, assistive artificial intelligence technology is going to be significant. If you understand it and can work with it, you'll have a major leg up economically in the workforce and stuff. And his thing was basically saying something like, much like in the last 50 years, we've transitioned from pen, paper, typewriters, and whatever to like smartphones and computers and the internet. Like he's like, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe 10 years, we'll have just as much change, but in 5 times less span of time.
Yeah.
And again, it's just a relative. It's just of mine. Just interesting perspective. Like man, like stuff's changing fast. Yeah. And I think that's partly why, again, back to my introductory sermon in Genesis, I'm wanting to help anchor people, to bring foundation. Like, hey, but this stuff doesn't change. Humans creating culture doesn't change because they're made in the image of God. We just have to discern rightly how Christ wants us to be salt, leaven, and light in the midst of it.
I love that. Well, hey, if we rewind a couple years ago, I remember having a conversation with you where you just casually dropped this phrase, divine counsel. And I remember thinking, divine counsel, like, is Ryan running for election? Like what's going on?
Nope, he's definitely not running for election. I don't feel a calling. We have people in our church who are engaged in politics, and I love that. I think that's good. I think that's great, but it's not my calling.
Perfect. Well, we'll stay out of that. But I remember the subject coming up, and I was just so like, I was almost a little uneasy because I hadn't heard of it. And so I just want to give people permission. Like, it's okay that you don't feel immediately comfortable with this because it is kind of interesting. But when I asked you for more information, like I normally do, you actually pointed us to Genesis because of Dr. Michael Heiser, who you had heard this. And so what I want to do right now is in our previous sermon, we talked about the us, the plural R, that God references himself and somebody else. And immediately, upon my first interpretation of that, because we're all interpreting, I was like, oh, that's the Trinity. And you're like, okay, not so quick. So what's the not so quick? What could the us maybe be?
So let us make man in our image and after our likeness. So without question, in the Hebrew language, there's plural reality there. So what is that? Okay, so to help people, yes. I noticed this on Sunday when I was sharing this. Some people in the room nodding their head like I've heard that before. Other people like, at least their faces. Some of y'all don't. Some of y'all don't know. Like some of your faces were like, our pastor's just gone off the deep end. He's lost his ever-loving mind. I promise you, I'm not a heretic. You can read this all over the place. Dr. Michael Heiser is not a fringe Hebrew scholar. Even like someone, like Desiring God Ministries. They've written an article on Dr. Heiser's work and kind of like the reality of divine counsel and what that is. So it's just that a lot of us have never studied it that deeply. And admittedly, here I am, pastor. I've been one for 20. How long have I been a pastor, Sean?
I don't know. Too long.
I've been preaching for 24 years. I've been a pastor for 21.
Okay.
Yeah.
A couple decades.
Yeah. So it wasn't until one of our board members, which is kind of cool, he said, hey, I want you to read this book by Dr. Michael Heiser. I'd never heard of Dr. Michael Heiser. It was called The Unseen Realm.
Which the title of the book right there.
I was like legit. That's cool. The Unseen Realm. It sounds interesting. It sounds legit. So I got it and I started reading it and I couldn't stop. I couldn't put it down. It was so fascinating. Admittedly, when I first started reading it, I felt that kind of uncertainty and insecurity. Like, is this guy a Mormon? Is he like a polytheist? Like, what do you mean there's there's a divine council and there's like other divine beings. I'm like, like my red alerts are going off like, no. But Dr. Heiser goes to great lengths to show, and many have vetted his work and read it and worked through it. Like, he's not saying that there is more than one Most High God. There's only one Most High God, Creator God, Elohim, Yahweh. But the Bible does have a handful, like a bunch of places that discuss this reality of the divine council, or what it's commonly interpreted as in our Bibles. Like I preach from the ESV, and this is how the ESV interprets it, is the sons of God. So there's a few things I want to say to people. Okay, let us make man in our image. Could it be Trinity? Maybe, but it's not. It's really not. Like, you can have that view, it's fine, but I think I'm like 90% sure that view's not right. I think there's way greater biblical evidence that it's the sons of God. It's this heavenly host of beings, supernatural beings. So here's the idea of it. I'm just going to explain this real quick and then reference where people can go check it out and do some of their own research, and I'll try to help them. Humanity is God's earthly family, but God created a heavenly family before he created an earthly family. Before you kind of go, how do you know that? Well, where did Lucifer come from? We're going to get to that in Genesis 3. Who's this shimmering, shining, the Satan? Who's that character? Where did, the creatures in the Bible, the cherubim and the seraphim who are guarding the Garden of Eden with a flaming sword after God kicks Adam and Eve out, where'd that character come from? None of us would really debate, because the New Testament deals much more with demons. We read about them more specifically because the ministry of Christ is so potent. The demonic manifestations that occur in the Gospels are many. And so Jesus confronts the works of Satan, the devil, the evil one, and his demons. And so we have to then go into the Old Testament and go, is that just like a New Testament thing, or where's that at? Well, this idea of supernatural beings is all over the Old Testament. And I think the first indication of it is in Genesis 1:26. Let us make man in our image. They're not demonic at that point. They're heavenly supernatural beings that God made. And if we use the term in his image, they have some semblance of the image of God, their capacity to choose, to create in the spirit realm. And so when Elohim Yahweh turns to the other Elohim, because that's how it gets interpreted in the Bible. Don't get mad at me. Read Dr. Heiser. It's in Psalms, it's in Deuteronomy, it's in Genesis, it's in Job. The sons of God, in Hebrew, that's Elohim. So wait a second. The Elohim turns to Elohim. Elohim Yahweh turns to Elohim and says all these things. So I think it makes sense to go, God is turning and looking at his heavenly family. Let us make man in our image. Now the concern right away is, wait a minute, is God creating this, or is this kind of the ancient, Mesopotamian creation myths that these lesser demigods are fighting for power and creating? No, the text is clear. He turns to them and says, hey guys, let's go make some pizza. Let's go get some pizza. But what does he mean? I'm getting the pizza. Just because he says let's in us, it doesn't mean us is doing the creating. It means us is the context from which he's trying to help derive the idea that he's going to make unique image bearers to dwell on earth. And that's humanity. So that's interesting. You go, oh, okay. Well, it moves on rather quickly in Genesis 1 because it simply goes, then God created man, male and female, who created them. So Yahweh does the creating. But we're going to get to Genesis 3 and we're going to see a serpent show up. Who the heck is that? Well, it's one of these beings. And then we're also going to get to Genesis 6. And I'm going to preach on this. Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4. The sons of God come down and impregnate. They have sex with the daughters of men and create the giants, the Nephilim. What? And Heiser's advocation is, a lot of us want to just skip over hard parts of the Bible and just ignore them. But if we were to think about the Bible from the worldview of the writers in which it was produced, then we would recognize this and see it all over the place. And so you see this in Job. The divine council is discussing Yahweh's servant Job. And then you even see Satan allowed to come and have court in that council and says the only reason he follows you is because you're so good to him. Let me have a hand at him and he'll reject you.
Yeah.
So Job all of a sudden starts to make a different kind of sense. You see, and I'm gonna read this. I'm gonna show you this here. Other parts of the Bible where this is present. Genesis 6, I already mentioned. Deuteronomy 32. Listen to this. Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. Moses says, when the Most High, and that's also a title used for God a lot in the Old Testament, the Most High, because there were other high, but not the Most High.
Yep.
They're not the creator, sovereign, before all, above all, creator God. There's this other supernatural beings at play as well. So listen to this. This is in your Bible, people. Not a lot of people know this because they don't study it. And if you want to, it's very fascinating. And I highly recommend Unseen Realm. I think everyone that's a nerd listening to this podcast, if you are, you qualify. You're a nerd. Love you. Go read it. Deuteronomy 32:8. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, when did this happen? Genesis 11, 10 and 11, Tower of Babel. So this is being referenced in Deuteronomy 32. He, the Most High, fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. What? What? Some translations change sons of God to sons of Israel. But again, the Greek Septuagint, I think, does angels of God. Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts, when discovered, say sons of God. And again, it's this appearing to refer to the Tower of Babel and the dispersal of nations. And so here, the sons of God would seem to be that God assigned heavenly beings to the various nations of mankind. By contrast to those nations, who was Israel's inheritance? The Lord, Yahweh. And so, again, this is like right in your Bible.
Yeah.
And Dr. Heiser talks about this as it relates to the Psalms, and I don't quite remember it super clearly, so I'll just let you read the book or read article. He actually has a shortened book called Supernatural, which is much easier and accessible. I think Unseen Realm is like 500 pages or 4 or 5. So
Yeah, Supernatural sounds like my speed.
yeah, so Supernatural is a little bit more like layman's version to kind of get you caught up. But like my dad, been a pastor for 45 years, read it, agrees with it. He's like, wow. I've talked to a few people at Trope Church just last Sunday because they knew what I was talking about. And they're like, dude, I read that book. It totally opened my eyes to a different level of detail and understanding and holistic like cohesion to the Old Testament. It does not threaten monotheism. It is not advocating polytheism. It is not contradicting Trinitarian truth, Father, Son, Spirit. It is not in any way, Mormonism, where we can become gods. This is just simply acknowledging our God is a creator, and he created spiritual, supernatural realm beings, and he created human natural realm beings. And we know this because the whole scripture has affirmed this, angels and demons, and also these other kind of beings. And the scriptures seem to indicate that they were a part of the heavenly family with Yahweh and a part of a council. Who's running point? Yahweh. Who's the King of Kings? Yahweh. Who's the Lord of Lords? Yahweh. So yeah, that's the whole divine council concept. And again, I am fully persuaded by it. I don't like, it doesn't cause me to like preach that differently unless I'm doing Genesis or like a particular text that's going to bring that out. What it's done for me is it's just added a significant amount of nuance and clarity to the worldview that biblical writers had, and a little bit more of a respect and renewed interest for the supernatural realm and reality that we often try to ignore.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes I think Craig Rochelle has a book on this called is it called Christian Atheist or like, what is it called? Practical Atheist or Functional Atheist, and how a lot of Christians, their life is so naturalized that there's no supernatural element to our lives. Yet we claim to believe in a God that raises the dead.
Yeah.
And speaks worlds into existence. And then we get all uncomfortable with the idea that like there's supernatural beings. But they're in the scripture. There's weird creatures in Isaiah when he has the vision of the Lord and the train of his robe filling the temple. There's weird supernatural creatures in Revelation. There's, again, cherubim, seraphim in the Garden of Eden.
You've got angels, you've got demons, you've got archangels, you've got this weird creature, the Satan, which literally is the shimmering, shining one. What is so clearly? There's a whole supernatural deal out there, and I think it's rather cool to see that that is actually introduced and not hidden and right in plain sight in Genesis 1:26.
Yep. Yeah, like for me, when I first read that, and you say, I don't know, or you said, I don't think the Trinitarian view of us is the correct view. I think it is the divine counsel right there. Like, why does that matter? Like, why does that matter to distinguish that?
Well, I think in some senses, it depends on how it doesn't matter. Like the Trinity is not hanging on the thread of Genesis 1:26. Like we don't need Genesis 1:26 to be Trinitarian to still hardly affirm and defend the reality of Father, Son, and Spirit. One Godhead, three distinct persons. But one of the things we tend to do in a lot of ways is we get overzealous for doctrines we want to protect. And so we can have a tendency to overread them. So one of the things Augustine said, and I love this, is in the old revealed, or in the new revealed, the old concealed. So in the Old Testament, these things were concealed, and in the new, they've been revealed. And I think that that's a perfect, the Old Testament, I think, does speak of, you can see the Trinity in the Old Testament, but it's most certainly fleshed out in much greater clarity with Jesus coming and New Testament doctrine. So again, I just don't think we have to press Genesis 1:26 to be a Trinitarian proof.
Yeah.
I don't think it's like done damage by reading it that way. That's how I read it my entire life until like 3 or 4 years ago. And I was like, oh, okay. Is it still a triune God and he's a community God and that's why we're made for community? Oh yeah. But that exact inference is more likely. I think there's more evidence biblically, and scholars, by the way, just so you know, conservative scholars, like almost all scholars agree. There's very few scholars that are going to advocate that is. I think Dr. Heiser's work's been so effective at showing that. Most of them are going to go, yeah, that's a stronger position. But the reason why I would say it almost doesn't matter is it doesn't change anything. Even if you say that's not the divine counsel, what are you going to do with Deuteronomy 32? What are you going to do with Psalms? I can't remember where it is, like Psalm 80. I might be able to find it here.
Well, and we're going to go through more passages in Genesis that reference it. So it's
Genesis
unavoidable.
6. Yeah. What do you do with that? So yeah, again, some sort of mystery there, right? Like a supernatural being who we would call Lucifer, the Satan, shows up in some sort of personified way, written down as a snake, to interact with fully human Eve and Adam. And so this mystery of where the supernatural and natural realms collide and where they overlap and where there's things that occur. I mean, you see that in Genesis 6. And there's different views on Genesis 6. All these things for me, I don't stress out about because they're interesting, and it's okay to have slightly different views because they don't upset creedal, distinctive Christian doctrine. They're just like nuanced views that we wrestle with related to the biblical text. And that makes them fascinating. And I think when we get those views more right than wrong, it makes more of the Bible come alive.
Yeah, it does.
And that's for people that have read Unseen Realm, that's what all of them say to me. And I probably, at least a couple dozen people at True Up Church I've recommended it to and I've read it. And every one of them, they're just like, whoa, dude. It's like the whole Old Testament came alive to me. Like things started making more sense. I was like, dude. Totes. Totes.
Yeah. Well, you and I had a conversation at the end of this last year as we were wrapping up our Bible reading plan. And you're like, so what's your overall summary of the Bible? And really succinctly, it's the Bible's all about God and his redemptive plan for history and for his people. And I think that's the thing about the Old Testament is there's these weird aspects to it, but it further just reveals how unique our Creator is. Yeah. And that's exciting. Yeah. The last subject we want to cover today, and one that has a lot of in our culture, it's sensitive, is just this idea of male and female genders, and we see it from the beginning of Scripture. In Genesis, God created male and female, and I know we don't have to belabor the point here because I know we're going to go even further on this
in Genesis 2. Yeah.
But maybe just because you hit on it, and to go a little deeper, like. Yeah, how do we address this conversation in our current cultural moment? Because I mean, we know we feel it with our neighbors and even people within our own church that we call our brothers. Like,
Yeah.
this is sensitive.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, we have people whether it's family members or individuals that are participating in worship at True Hope Church who maybe they experience some level of gender dysphoria. They feel like they're an alien in their own body. Anatomically, they're male or female, but they feel like they are different, that they're contrary to their embodied sex, or maybe even the complicated question of intersex. When I mentioned in preaching this that God made us male and female, I don't recant. I don't change my mind. I don't have a different position. Yes, that does not mean that there aren't a very, very minor percentage of individuals who, because of chromosomal abnormality or an anatomical reality, have different or both expressions of sexual anatomy. Like those are unique scenarios, and they still bear the image of God in a creative, unique way. But just because there are unique and particular variations, which in a very, 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 very small, I think the data, by the way, on that, if anybody's curious, like the lowest end would say that intersexuality is like 0.02%. The highest would be like, the highest appraised would be just over 1%, maybe 1.5%. But the thing is intersex represents itself from a medical perspective in a range of scenarios. The vast majority, like 90% of those medical realities, the individual presents anatomically very distinctively male or female. So it's just very, 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 very rare. And it's a sensitive subject because you don't want to just say, well, one of the theological answers most would have is, well, we're all born in fallen bodies because of sin. And that can be both liberating to some people and frustrating. I mean, and I know it's not the same thing, but I have a daughter with disability. And so you navigate the thing of like, well, why do people have disabilities? Did God not uniquely make them and put his image on them and love them? Of course. But isn't it also true that part of that reality of our flawed nature, like every one of us in our bodies is flawed? I mean, I have a wife with kidney disease. I have a daughter with muscular dystrophy. Like our bodies are frail. I have vitiligo. Like I have a autoimmune disease. Like, so, our bodies matter. Our bodies are sexed. We are born with sex chromosomes and sexual anatomy. And I think the scriptures are clear, and I think science and biology is actually clear that is male and female. Now, there's lots of people who get mad about that. I mean, they get angry. It's like, no, there's 4 or 5 biological sexes, or our culture is thinking about this area more this way. Well, sex and gender, gender identity is more important than sexual anatomy or biology. So how I want to present or how I feel about myself is what's true about my identity, not given. But this goes back to kind of my whole point about Genesis and why I think it's important for us to study this and have a biblical worldview. So much of what Genesis is saying is you don't get to construct. You don't construct creation. You get to steward it and create culture. You don't get to construct reality. You don't get to construct. You receive it. You receive what's been created. You receive identity. You receive purpose. You receive responsibility. You receive vocation and calling. You receive it. You receive life as a gift from God. You don't make life as an invention of your own potential.
That's good.
But that just flies in the face. I mean, I take heat for that, plenty of heat for it. So, we'll talk on this more, but I just think it's right there in the text. I'm not going to apologize for it. I know there are people in our church who have friends and children and relatives who are not in agreement with that. They're non-binary. They have a fluid perspective on gender as a spectrum. What I want to say is, at True Hope Church, we believe, and what I preach and teach, and I believe is the historic Christian traditional ethic on gender, sexuality, and marriage, is that God has given us 2 sexes, male and female. And yes, there are unique scenarios of intersex where there's some
anatomical and even chromosomal male and female occurring there. But just because that happens in a variation doesn't mean you create a whole new category. It's not a third category. It's a unique variation of the two categories. And I would say because of our doctrine of the fall that we all face. And that's why that is. So there's two sexes in God's designed order, male and female. They are beautifully complementary. And they are co-equal in essence and dignity. The image of God is stamped on them both in fullness. The image of God is not about your qualities. It's not about how smart you are, how agile you are, how emotionally sensitive or in tune you are. It's not about your capacity to love. Something about those qualities is definitely derived from God's characteristics that are being shared with us, but to be an imager, an image bearer, a mirror of God is a status irrevocably given, not incrementally received. It does not diminish. So you can be in a wheelchair, you can be differently abled, you can be challenged in your cognitive function. You bear the image of God in fullness, irrevocably. Therefore, you matter. You are worth protecting. Even people who disagree with me, this is important, on their being male and female. Even those who espouse and think LGBTQIA and all of the philosophy therein, they still, every person bears the image of God. You can't sin your way out of the image of God. You can't. You cannot. To be human is to be the image of God, and that's how much humanity matters. That is a massive pro-life ethic.
Yeah,
that means life matters. We should protect it and preserve it and celebrate it, whilst we can disagree on what life should look like expressed under the vision of God's design for our sex, sexuality, gender, work, recreation, speaking, thinking, behaving, playing. God has a vision for how his image bearers should function. But the essence of our being is established as valuable and dignified because of the majesty of the Creator God. So yeah, I mean, it's really, really important. It doesn't make me popular today, right? It's not a popular view, but I think it's what the Bible teaches, not just in Genesis 1. I think it teaches it all the way through everywhere else. And I think it's worth saying what God says.
So good. Thank you for this conversation and helping us navigate these difficult conversations. For any of you listening online, we have an email address, sermon@truehopechurch.org.
Yep.
If you want a shot at maybe submitting a question, we'll take a look at it. Not a guarantee it'll get brought up, but we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
Have a wonderful week. See you next time.